Welcome to Connecting the Dots, an Amici podcast presented by me, George Mingozzi-Marsh, where each episode I meet with an artist to chat about their community, collaborations, and how these connections continue to shape the artists they are today. If you're watching the video version of this podcast at Amici.Art, then keep watching at the end of some bonus footage of my studio visit with Ty. This episode was recorded in early February in Mexico City during their annual art week. As we discuss, Ty had been on a residency there since just before New Year's Eve, which had been supported by his London gallery, Copperfield, and Knotenpunks, a foundation that supports artists by encouraging dialogue and building community and enabling their research and production. And this residency was taking place at Studio Block M74 in Mexico City, which is a fantastic, dedicated sculpture studio run by artists and set up by artists. This was actually the first time I had met Ty in person, although I had been aware of him and his work for a little while. And as you will hear, he is charmingly and disarmingly honest and open. And this conversation was a real and absolute pleasure. I began by asking Ty if he could tell us a little bit about his background, how he became an artist, and how the way he grew up feeds into his artistic practice.
Yeah, it's funny because my work has only become autobiographical recently because I started therapy. So before that, I come from a family of quite severe poverty and neglect, which was actually, I kind of used as a superpower because it meant nobody told me I could or couldn't do something. So it meant when I realized I enjoy art, I could just run with it. And none of my family have ever owned houses or got married or did things conventionally. But my mum was always incredibly creative. So I'm the oldest of one of 7. So she had lots of kids, 2 twins a year apart. So she had 4 one-year-old boys. And she would cover the kitchen floor in paper and give us paint and vegetables and let us make a mess. And she would draw us pictures to color in. And I was always so inspired by her ability to just draw an image.
Yeah.
And also being severely dyslexic, academically I found lots of subjects really challenging. So when I went into year 7 and we was in art class, we all got told to draw a shell because it was natural form. And I drew this shell with a pencil and everyone was like, how did you do that? And it was the first thing I've ever drawn. I was like, oh my God, thank God, something I'm naturally good at, finally.
So it was kind of validating.
Yeah, exactly. Or it was more, not only did I enjoy it, but I could be confident about it.
Yeah.
Because in English and science, it was always reading and spelling was always so difficult. And I wasn't diagnosed till I went to university for dyslexia. So then as soon as that happened, I was hooked immediately. But even as a kid, when I was 11 or 12, I was obsessed with labor in a weird way. I watched this video.
The act of making, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. I watched this video of somebody making an origami boat, and I was probably 11.
Yeah.
And I was so amazed that this flat piece of paper turned into something physical that I replayed it over and over and over again until I could make them with my eyes closed. And I made them as big as I could out of tin foil, out of cardboard. It's so small, I used chopsticks, and I ended up with this huge pile of origami boats. And that's exactly what I do now. It's just kind of changed form, the way I present that labor. But it was definitely my way of finding a comfort in quite a uncomfortable environment.
Yeah. So I mean, you've mentioned that it's only more recently that these themes of kind of identity and class have kind of come into your practice.
Yes.
Was there a kind of a turning point? Was there kind of a transition? Was it kind of a gradual transition, or did it happen very suddenly? You suddenly thought, actually, this is something I need to talk about or I want to talk about?
Well, the thing is, my involvement in making art was not influenced by any culture. I grew up with zero culture.
Right.
I never saw galleries, I never saw theatres, I barely saw movies. I barely got my hair cut, it was so my practice was actually my way of distracting from that. So I was why would I, in my BA, I was why would I make work about that when that's what the work is distracting from? But then I started therapy. So I realized my practice is like a sponge to like understand my surroundings. And after 2 years of therapy, when I understood how I felt about it, it then came into the work naturally. And it's the same with lots of things in my life, that the position I end up in or my understanding, I can't help but let it seep into the work.
Yeah.
Because it just like, the way I make work is through instinct, you know? So it wasn't, I did therapy during COVID and then I went to Slade.
Yeah.
And it just so happened that.
So when you arrived at Slade, you were already thinking and working in those, you know, in those ways?
It all happened at the beginning of that journey, which also coincided with like super good articulation from tutors. And like, you know, I think an MA is about why you make your work, not what you're making. So it kind of coincided at a good time. And then my work became autobiographical.
And then, I mean, there's an obvious kind of vulnerability in that. I mean, your solo show, is it Kitchen Sink Drama?
Yes.
Copfield.
Yes.
So some of the kind of themes and ideas that were kind of brought up in that show are obviously quite exposing, quite kind of vulnerable, like I say. Like, how did it feel putting that out into the world? And what was the kind of response you got back from giving that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I've always been an open book from a very young age. I think like my family are never scared to talk about stuff, and like, you know, we talk about things that are very taboo very openly. So I've always been very up for sharing, but I'm still trying to figure out how much I want to share through my artwork. So if the artwork is about something that happened to me directly, I'm happy to talk about it because it's in the work.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how to not tokenize an experience, you know. But the response is really nice because the work initially has a kind of humorous presentation, so it has an accessibility. And then when they hear the dialogue from me or read the text, it then has this kind of like dark humor or this like extra layer of tragedy. So it's people find it super relatable and accessible to their experience, which I didn't expect, you know.
So, I mean, you use the word kind of tokenized there, and it's not something I'd kind of thought about before, but obviously the contemporary art world in so many ways has a kind of a problem with privilege. Like it is the majority of people who are able to go to art school these days are from privileged backgrounds. The majority of people who kind of collect and invest in art and kind of support art from kind of privileged backgrounds. Is there a concern there is this kind of, you feel tokenized, or you feel that there is this kind of like voyeurism, or is there kind of, you haven't had that experience with the government? Because you said you've had, you know, people feel like they can kind of engage with it on a personal level, or find things in it themselves that they're responding to. I'm just quite interested how that has transpired.
No, it's something I'm still working out, and I think I will always be working out. I think for me, it's the pace in which I want to process those things through my work is the pace in which I want people to see that.
Yeah,
you know?
nice. Yeah.
So it's very personal.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not like I'm averse to people knowing, because, you know, it's like that is the point of me making this stuff, is like, for me, is processing something. But I'm really glad that I got into Slade and all of this happened before it became autobiographical, because I didn't ever want to feel like, because I come from this like hideously poor background, that's why people like the work.
Yeah, sure.
You know, so I kept the way it's presented, but then added it at the back.
So you feel like you've got kind of control of the situation. It's an ongoing conversation rather than a declarative statement. You kind of
Exactly, and you know, I might have a solo show in the future that is only about that, and I might have another show that has nothing to do with it. And I think it's literally based on the body of work that I'm making.
Yeah.
And you know, working with the Copperfield directly since graduating, it's been really interesting figuring out other people's point of views on that narrative and how much I want them to share, and you know, how much I'm willing to allow them to have the information to share. You know, it's very much a learning. I'm learning about it all as it goes.
You often use found and kind of familiar objects in your work, which I suppose is kind of a way that people can have an entry point, a level of kind of engagement with things. Is that a kind of a deliberate exercise in trying to draw people in, or is that more kind of a necessity, or these things are around you anyway, so you're kind of instinctively working with them, or somewhere in between those?
Yeah, I think initially when I started it's quite interesting because in my sixth form, they told me I wasn't allowed to make sculpture because there wasn't enough space.
Yeah.
So then I was like, well, now I only want to make sculpture. It's like, I can't give me this limitation.
Yeah.
So then when I went on to my BA, I was like, fuck it, I'm just going to be sculpture.
Yeah.
But then because I didn't have any money, everything I used, I found on the street, and I think I'm quite heavily dyslexic, so my brain is quite logical, and there's something about working with a material that has so many limitations that it limits my possibilities of what I can do. Whereas like painting is like incredibly intimidating for me because it's like a flat image, any color, any size, any shape. Whereas, I can only make a chair look horny in like 6 different ways. It's like, I really like having limitations to work against. That's why I also like showing in stranger places like kitchens.
Yeah.
Because it's just like problem solving. And I think my upbringing was actually really vital because it allowed me to be very unprecious. So in my BA, when I had a tutorial about a work, I'd put it in a skip. It was like, so I came to Slade with this ability to just like make and react, whereas lots of people had like a lot of pressure externally from parents or, so it just meant I could react.
Yeah. I think sort of several interesting things in that. I wanted to kind of unpick slightly. But part of it, I suppose, is this idea of the way you use objects, you're kind of subverting their function. And I want to kind of draw a slight line, I suppose, between that kind of subversiveness and the kind of inherent queerness of your work that you've kind of spoken about and before. And whether this idea that kind of queer culture, as it were, whether that is drag performing or otherwise, has been for so long this active kind of subversive resistance and celebration. And whether or not you see that, the kind of a through line between how you use materials, how you kind of approach the making of your work, and like you've spoken about, the kind of inherent queerness in it.
Yeah, I think being queer has been a superpower because it meant that I was able to like react to society and have a community that was inherently subversive.
Yeah.
And like already, as somebody like me shouldn't be at the Slade, so that already being there, I was like on the border. So then being queer as well meant I could exist in a community that also existed on that border. And, I was an artist before I was gay. It took me quite a long time to figure that out. I didn't come out till I was like 18.
Right.
But now it's like, my chosen family around me is like my body and soul. It's like, I don't have a relationship with my parents, but my chosen family are the ones that look after me. So it's been such a privilege, And, the work has a queerness to it, but I think that's inherent. I can't control that really, because that is, as I said, it kind of just seeps out.
Yeah. I think that I think one of the reasons that your work is as successful as it is because it has a kind of an outsider's perspective without being othering, if you know what I mean. Like it still feels open. It still feels like you're inviting people in. It doesn't feel like you're putting up kind of boundaries or barriers. And I suppose, like we sort of spoke about earlier about kind of your background, it doesn't feel like there is a kind of a voyeurism in the work, or like I say, an exclusivity to it. It's an open conversation. It feels like it's you're one part of that conversation, and you're inviting other people to be a part of that conversation as well.
Well, I think like I have this really interesting gauge where the more art education or the more kind of like gallery success or whatever, I've realized the gauge of a successful work for me is if my siblings still like it. So it's like, I'm the oldest of one of 7. Really? None of them have ever gone to university. None of them have any art education. And like, I adore, they are such a huge part of me. It's like 60% of my being is there.
Yeah.
And the 40% is education.
Yeah.
But if I make a work that they like, and because a curator and a gallerist can fluff something up and that's great. But if they connect to it and they find it accessible, then I know I'm making the right work. Because I don't ever want to get lost up in this kind of like fluff, And I went to my brother's baby shower recently, and all of my siblings were having a discussion of their favourite work of mine. And my brother was like, "Oh, it's the horny bench, come on." And my sister was like, "No, it's the clock he cut in half. That's my favourite." And I was like, "That's really nice to know that they also can connect to it."
Yeah, it's lovely. I mean, right now we're in Studio Block M74 in Mexico City, where you've been on this residency since New Year?
Just before New Year's Eve, yeah.
And we're now in Mexico City's Art Week with kind of Material, where you're going to be exhibiting with Copfield. How has the experience of being somewhere, I'm assuming, completely alien to you, kind of taking you out of a comfort zone, putting you into a completely different cultural setting, how have you felt that has informed your work?
It's quite interesting because this is kind of the first time I've ever been in a country where they don't speak English. Yeah. I'm not very well travelled, and it's like, I think the gallery saw my ability to adapt, and they were confident that I was going to be able to do that, whereas I literally had no expectations. It's like, the only thing I came with was a knowledge that for the first month I had to be prolific. Yeah, that was it. In terms of that, my brain was like shiny. It was like, okay, I'm just going to see what happens. Yeah. And it's a super daunting task to respond to an alien culture, because I don't want, as I said about my own experience, I don't want to tokenize anything. So but making art and having this practice is my way of feeling comfortable somewhere. So that's all I did is I get to live in this studio for 2 months and be around my work in this giant studio and have 4 works on at the go at the same time. But sitting down and making something is how I feel comfortable.
It's your way of understanding the world.
Yeah, exactly. I put it through that queer dyslexic lens. Yeah. So it's the first week I just saw everything in Mexico. We called it Inspirational Week, and we went to every museum, the temples, and then I just started making. And luckily my practice is instinctual, so I articulate it after. So it's oh, I feel like doing this, and then this is nice, and I've been this, and I don't like that. So, but I think Mexico, I'm in love with the city. There's such an inherent joy for music and food and color and community, and England doesn't have that. Yeah. So all of a sudden, my work has become super colorful and playful, which is nice.
Yeah. I think there's also a kind of a culture of make, do, and mend here. It's a very you walk around Mexico City, and there's kind of improvised repairs and sort of ramshackle structures, and people have kind of made their own signage out of this and that. It's a very much kind of a do-it-yourself culture, and I know an aspect of that has always been there in your practice, but it feels like such a natural pairing, and you can kind of see what has come out of that, I think.
Yeah, it's funny because in England, all of my work is objects I find on the street, whereas here, because they use everything, there is nothing on the street, So it's I had to adjust my way of making because I had to respond to things, but also find out where I can buy them, So that was also quite an adjustment. But I think Mexico, as a sculptor, it's the joy for craft here and detail. Yeah. It's
an adornment. Everything's kind of fancified. Everything's kind of.
It's a shrine in the street that has tacky fairy lights all over it. Yeah. It's the joy in that.
Yeah, there was amazing where we were staying. We walked past a little shrine. It's like a Jesus disco, kind of flashing strobe lights, and Jesus and Mary in there with a kind of colourful glitters.
And it somehow works.
But it's so amazing.
Yeah. It's just ingenious, and camp and tacky and kitsch and colourful and Yeah, I love all of that.
Do you think it's something that you will kind of take home with you? Do you think this is a body of work that exists only here, or do you think something has kind of found its way into your kind of practice from this?
I think this body of work will only exist here. I'm not going to be going home and making artwork about votives, but I think the experience of being embedded in another culture is going to be influencing my work for the next couple of years, I imagine. Yeah. The way my practice functions in my life, it's all just going to slowly seep in. And, this is the first time in my life I've had a perspective of leaving England, So it's even that, it's opened the world up for me slightly, which is really exciting because it's everything seems slightly less intimidating. Yeah. In a way.
That's amazing.
Yeah. No, it's Yeah, it's an incredible privilege. I mean, you know, also to be here to do my favourite thing. It's like it's quite lucky.
So beyond this week, you're exhibiting at the art fair. You know, what are your kind of hopes, plans for the rest of the year or the years coming? Have you got a kind of, you said you work quite instinctively, so I'm kind of interested in whether or not you're kind of throwing yourself forward into the future, or whether you're just like, no, next challenge comes, I'll deal with that when it comes.
I'm here to the 28th of February, but I have a solo show in Vienna in May, and it's so interesting because I was making the work for that in December.
Right.
Then I paused it all, came here with nothing. Then when I land back in London, I have to finish that work very quickly.
Yeah.
And then I have the show in Vienna.
Yeah.
But my brain has not thought further than that. So, you know.
Yeah, fair enough.
But the show in Vienna is 2 floors, and I'm gonna do, in the basement, I might do like a huge, great big orgy of plastic chairs, like a dark room kind of, and then upstairs will be like domestic. So it's like relating my domestic life to my queer life in these kind of strange sculptures.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that's next on the list, and it doesn't go further than that.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for talking to me. It's been great.
That's all right. Thank you so much. Yeah.
A big thank you to Ty and his gallery Copperfield for their generosity and time during a very busy week. It was great that we managed to fit in this conversation just earlier that morning. There had been an open studio at M74 with lots of collectors and patrons coming through to talk to the artist. So Ty had already had several hours of discussing his practice before I even got to sit down with him. I can highly recommend taking a look online at Ty's 2023 solo exhibition at Copperfield Gallery in London, titled Kitchen Sink Drama. Although I had seen bits of his work before and had heard people discussing Ty and his practice as someone exciting to be looking out for, that was the first time I had seen a body of his work altogether and really got a feel for some of the things that he was trying to communicate, and actually seeing for myself the clarity of voice that he has as an artist. And I think he's a really distinctive young talent who we can expect to see a lot more of over the coming years. This was the first of a few conversations that I managed to record with different artists while I was in Mexico City, and we will be releasing more of those as future episodes of the Connecting the Dots podcast. So do subscribe or keep a lookout on our Instagram, which is Amici__Art. Mexico City has an amazing dynamism at the moment and an optimism, with artists and creative people flocking from all around the world to be a part of this incredible community. And now, for those of you watching here at Amici.Art, here is a little bit more from my studio visit with Ty, where he introduces me to one of the new series of works that he was producing in Mexico. What are all these brightly coloured fabrics you've got here?
These are all of the tote bags from all the different supermarkets that I made the stained glass with. So the stained glass is all of these food containers that accidentally look like windows anyway. But I cut the flat pieces of metal to make the bread for the toaster necklace. And then I realized it looks like a stained glass, and I made one, and this is the original. Oh, I think I've hid it somewhere. But I made one and I just tied it to my light, and I was like, oh, there's something in this. So then people started just giving me all of their shopping bags.
I love that high-low culture moment. You think of like stained glasses as this kind of reverent sort of hallowed thing, and then you're talking about takeaway tins and supermarket sort of tote bags.
But also like religion, food and shopping here is like, and it manages to be all of those things. I also had to learn how to wire LEDs, which was more complicated than I would like. But even the neon, which I made, which is one of the only works I brung here, this is the same kind of high brow, low brow. So this is like a budget neon out of bent biros with like a heat gun.
Is that what it is?
Yeah. So they're all individual biros. And my twin brother is a manager of a Poundland, which is like a supermarket in England where everything's £1. And I get the pens from there. And then because I'm heavily dyslexic, when I can't spell a word so bad that spell check doesn't know, I dictate it to my phone. So for the last 2 years, I've been keeping this list of all the words I have to dictate in chronological order.
Amazing.
And then they kind of make this like strange poetry.
I was going to say, it's like abstract poetry.
So the first one was Obnoxious Carbonara. But there's like delicately Balenciaga, professionally professional nephews. You know, it's like, so it's like budget spelling with a budget neon of budget spelling.